difference between an apostle and a disciple. And what does that have to do with us?
An apostle is a person that makes disciples.
Actually, it's a little further beyond that. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about Jesus calling the apostles. So let me read the passage. And this is Luke. And we're pulling stuff from other parts. This is actually in 3 Gospels. And there's other things about the apostles in John also. So we're pulling from all of them. But we're going to read the main passage from Luke. So this is Luke 6, 12 through 16. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. So,
You're all right.
so it's where we're going to answer. So first thing we're going to notice is, what's the first thing as disciples of Jesus that we notice about Jesus in this passage? What did he go and do?
Chose them.
Well, before that,
Prayed.
he prayed. How did he go and pray, Todd? What did he go and do?
Went out by himself.
Yeah. Remember, we talked about Todd's better at this than the rest of us.
On a mountainside.
Right. So so we talked about this when we talked about Jesus and solitude, that we are too busy. I mean, we really are. We're too busy. And sometimes we're too busy for Jesus. And that Jesus, plenty of times, got by himself, went out in the middle of nowhere, and just sat there quietly and prayed and thought and meditated. And that's something that I think as American Christians, but really as disciples of Jesus, we have to be better about, is getting out, getting away from it all, slowing down, stopping. And I got to force myself to do it. Because one of the reasons I struggle with it is because I like to read, and I'll spend my quiet time reading a lot. And if it was left up to me, I would spend all my quiet time reading and not spending any time thinking and meditating and praying. And so that's the first thing we learn from Jesus here. Now, here's the thing. Did Jesus really need to do this to choose the apostles? No. So again, this is an example for us. Right? A lot of things that Jesus does is an example for us. So before we have major decisions to make, what's one of the things we need to go and do? Pray, spend some time alone, solitude, sit and think about it, right? That's the first thing we notice. Jesus got away from everything, calmed down, quieted down, thought about things, made sure he was making the right decision. Even though he was going to make the right decision anyway, this is an example for us. All right, so he spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples. So here we get into the difference between the disciples and the apostles. Everybody who followed Jesus was a disciple, right? And we talked about that there really is no difference. There really should be no difference between being a Christian and being a disciple. We talked about in the book of Acts where it says it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. So you had to be a disciple to be called a Christian, right? There was no, these guys are disciples and these guys are Christians. There were only disciples, and Christian was just another name for disciple. So everybody followed Jesus was a disciple. But what he did then is that he designated 12 of them as apostles. Now we got to talk about the word apostle, and I'm trying to clear up a lot of confusion between the 3 Gospels and between things. So apostle this is one of the confusing things that happens with the New Testament. A lot of the titles that are used in the church today were just common words back then. So apostle was a common word, deacon was a common word, pastor was a common word. It was a common word that they took and turned into a title. So sometimes when you see it in the Bible, it is still the common word. Other times it is the title. Does that make sense? So here, the common word apostle meant a sent one, a messenger, and it's used elsewhere to refer to possibly missionaries. Right? People who would go, and church planters is another way that it's kind of used. But here it is used as a title. So, and they didn't do it with big A, little a, but the way we think about it is big A and little a. So big A apostle is these 12 guys plus Saul, who's later named Paul, and those are the only ones that we can 100% definitely say are apostles, big A. Then there's a debate about other people. There's debate about Matthias, and there's debate about a couple other people, whether they actually held the office and the title of apostle. But we only know for certain these guys held the office of apostle. And we also, the best theological answer is this office only existed in the first century. That there's churches now that use the title apostle, that's probably not biblically accurate. That it is only a title that existed in the first century. There were only these few people, and that's important. We're going to get back to why that's important in a minute. Okay, so he takes these guys. Everybody follows a disciple. He chooses out from the disciples 12 guys to be leaders and church planters. Right? That's going to be their job. So, but then I'm going to show you also something in here that I'm going to show you something in a little bit, that it doesn't necessarily, even his development of them doesn't necessarily mean they were going to be leaders and church planters, and I'll show you why. So the first one is Simon, whom he named Peter. So we know Simon Peter, we know him. His brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So let's go through these. Now, one of the things, the important thing about this is, that what you really learn from this is the guy that Jesus, this is the highest offices that have ever been held in the church. Right? This is the highest offices that have ever been in the church. He didn't pick seminary students. That's what we walk with. These are regular, average people, some of them higher educated than others. The only apostle who we could really count as like a seminary graduate or seminary student would be Paul. Now, Paul wrote most of the New Testament, so there is an argument for having a religious education. Paul presents us that argument, but it's also interesting that he's the last apostle ever picked. The first ones picked were not seminary students.
Just normal people.
Normal. That's the big thing that we walk away from this from. Right? That's one of the big things we walk away from here. So the brothers, Peter, who's called Simon, and Andrew. Now, one of the things, when it comes to Simon, Peter, and Andrew, is we lift Simon Peter up kind of high because we talk about this one time when Jesus asked, "Who do you say I am?" And he says, "You're the Messiah. You're the Son of God." Right? And we said, "Well, look, Peter was the first person to ever proclaim that." Actually, he wasn't. Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist who introduced his brother to Jesus by telling Peter, "We have found the Messiah." Who was the first person to openly proclaim that Jesus was the Messiah? It was actually Andrew. Right? Peter kind of gets all the glory on that, but it's actually his brother Andrew. And the important part of this is that one of these guys isn't necessarily more important than the others. Right? It's kind of spread around who does what. That's very important too. Now, sometimes you can say that three of them held somewhat of a higher office, but the responsibility and the revelation of who Jesus is spread around through these guys. And that kind of tells us not to fall into the trap of having this one guy who's set above everybody else, and what he says always goes. That's not the way a church is supposed to be.
Amen.
Right? If you have that, it's called a cult. Right? All right, so these guys were commercial fishermen who were most likely in partnership with Zebedee, who was the father of James and John. Now let's clear something else up here. So we tend to refer to these guys, you hear them called illiterate, poor fishermen. Probably not illiterate, probably not poor. Okay? Now, they were most likely what we would refer to as maybe redneck or country, because they're from Galilee, which was considered kind of the country, and we know that they had an accent because they could be recognized by their accent.
Just hardworking people.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Real men. Real men like Jesus.
Right. So here's the thing, but they're probably not poor because these are people who own boats and own fishing nets. So basically, think of a truck driver who owns his own truck.
Right.
Right? That's probably a good way to think about it, is a truck driver who owns his own truck. These are commercial businessmen. Now, here's another thing we put in here. So we know the story about them walking away from their boats and walking away from their nets. That doesn't necessarily mean that the business stopped.
Right.
Because Zebedee was still there, right?
Other people to man the boats.
Right. It may have been that Peter, James, and John, as partial owners of the business, still made a living off the business, but just weren't there in person manning it all the time.
That's right.
when they fully committed to following Jesus full time. Because at first they followed him part time, just like they had followed John the Baptist kind of part time. He was like their preacher they went and listened to, right? Well, at some point Jesus called, and we know that when Jesus calls these guys to full time follow him, that doesn't mean that necessarily that the business stopped running. Because we also know that Peter was married, right? And his wife may have stayed back and helped run the business, right? We don't know these things for certain, but we need to, and the reason I say that is we don't need to look at it as having a business is bad. Following Jesus means you need to not own a business.
Amen.
Okay? It is not a bad thing to own a business.
People had to eat fish.
Right. And so, and the other side of that is, does it, for the benefit of humanity, would it make more sense to have businesses run by unbelievers, ran by the standards of unbelievers, or for businesses to be owned by believers and ran by the standards of believers?
Amen.
Right. So it's always important here to get kind of the facts straight that these guys were businessmen. It's not necessarily that Jesus called them away from the business and the business shut down for forever and business is bad. That's not what's going on, right? But he did call these guys. Now, he did call them away ultimately from being full-time businessmen and being full-time church planters, and that does happen. Right? So that does happen. There are men who are called away from being full-time businessmen and become full-time pastors, become full-time church planters, but there's nothing wrong with being a business owner, owning a business, and still being a disciple of Jesus and using your business to benefit people in the world. Right? Does that make sense? That's a big thing we want to clear up. And they're probably not illiterate. The fact that they're businessmen, they probably need to be able to read and write. Right? They may actually be bilingual, because a lot of people in this area were, and they had to at least know some Greek. If they're businessmen, they probably have to know at least some Greek, right? And everybody in that area probably knew some Greek, so they're probably somewhat bilingual, and they're probably not illiterate. So I just want to clear that up. Okay, so then you have the two brothers, James and John, who were the sons of Zebedee, and these were also commercial fishermen that worked with Peter and Andrew. And they were called the Sons of Thunder. Now, one of the interesting things about them is both of them, before they became disciples of Jesus, were disciples of John the Baptist, right? So this was kind of they were kind of growing spiritually. Like they had figured out that what John the Baptist was saying was true compared to all the other rabbis. So they're following John the Baptist. John the Baptist says, okay, y'all need to quit following me, and now you need to follow Jesus. And they grow and they spiritually mature to following Jesus, right? Now, both of these were actually part of Jesus' inner circle, right? So that the inner circle consisted of Peter, James, and John. John was apparently Jesus' best friend, who also took care of Jesus' mother after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, right? That's how good of a friend he was. Because Jesus had brothers, but Jesus still picked John over his brothers for taking care, and his brothers ultimately did get saved. We see that in the book of Acts, that it's not that his brothers don't get saved. They do get saved, but Jesus still picks John to take care of his mother over his brothers. That's how close a relationship he had with John. Now, this is an interesting thing here. James is the first to be martyred. Okay? And this James is not James, the brother of Jesus, that you see in Acts. So when you see James in the book of Acts, that's generally talking about James, the brother of Jesus, leading the church in Jerusalem. James, the brother of John, was actually the first one to be martyred. And the interesting thing about that is, Jesus still developed him in his inner circle, knowing that he would never really truly be a leader in the church. Okay, my point being is, he developed him for the sake of developing him into the image of God that he was originally created to be.
That's for his own good.
Right, yeah. Okay, so that's one of the things that we need to. Yes, we are to develop men into be leaders, but our point is not simply to develop them to being leaders. And this is one of the traps that the church has fallen into, is we try to develop men simply into be leaders without considering, are we actually conforming them to the image of God that they were originally created to be. See, so James gives this picture where Jesus actually invites James into his inner circle so he can develop James, knowing that James is never actually going to get to be a real leader for very long. He develops him simply for the sake of developing him into the image of God he's supposed to be. You see that? that's important, because we talk about this inner circle being developed into leaders when it talks to Peter and John, but we've also got to remember that Jesus had James in his inner circle, and James never got to be a leader in the church because he died fairly soon. I mean, he was a leader for a little while, but not for very long.
He probably had a key role in supporting the others spiritually. The businesses did well on both ends. The big catch of fish,
Right.
there was a lot of money there. So that was in the beginning of Jesus' ministry and at the end when they went back to
Yeah.
fishing again.
Yeah.
So you know that somebody had to coordinate that, and maybe that
Yeah.
it was.
So one of the things that we know that their business didn't completely shut down was the ships and the nets were still there, right? And they were still in shape that they could put them out and go fishing with them immediately
And catch a lot.
and catch a lot of fish. Yeah. So again, we kind of missed that part. We were talking about the businesses. You were here. The businesses. There's nothing wrong with that. All right. So let's go on to the next guy. We want to get through with all 12 of these guys. The next one is Philip from Bethsaida. So he's from the same town as James and John and Andrew and Philip. Now here's and Peter. So here is an interesting thing is there's two sides of this. This is one of the things I want to show you. There's a lot of times in the Bible that there's two sides to things. You can't expect all your friends and family to follow Jesus. It's probably not going to happen. But you should try to get your friends and family to follow Jesus. Because here you have 5 guys who apparently lived in the same town and knew each other, who influenced all each other. And so you have these 5 guys from the same town who probably all knew each other, who were all part of Jesus' inner circle. Right? So it's not to say, hey, you may have to walk away from friends and family, but at the same time, you should try to reach your friends and family. That's a fairly high percentage rate of these one group of friends to be in Jesus' inner circle of disciples. Okay, and also when you're reading the book of Acts, do not confuse this Philip with Philip the evangelist. Philip the evangelist is the guy who converts like the eunuch, the Ethiopian eunuch, and has the $7. Don't confuse these two Philips. Okay, because again, it's just a common name at the time. All right, so the next guy is Bartholomew. Now, he is most likely named elsewhere as Nathaniel, and he is from Cana in Galilee in the book of John. So you have a guy named Nathaniel who's from Canaan, who's in Galilee, and he's considered one of Jesus' disciples. He is most likely Bartholomew because you don't have Bartholomew listed as a disciple in John. Very common for people to have multiple names. There's one guy, so the 2 guys that they're considering to be the replacement apostle in the book of Acts, one guy is known by 3 different names. Right? So part of it is the fact that they were often bilingual, so oftentimes you would have a Jewish name and then you would have a Greek name. Because we see like Matthew. Matthew is Greek, Levi is Jewish. Right? And because he had given up pretty much on being Jewish and he was working with the Romans, he was going by his Greek name, which was Matthew. We'll get to Matthew in a second. So we have this guy, Bartholomew, is more of is almost, because it could mean the son of, because anytime you see a bar, that means the son of, that could be his last name. That could be his surname. And then his given name is Nathaniel. We don't really know, but we assume these are probably 2 of the same guys. Another thing is he's also from he's from Galilee. He's not from Bethsaida, but he is from Cana. And the fact that he went fishing with the other guys in John 21 when they went back to fishing, because it's not all 12 that go back to fishing. It's just it's half of them basically. He's actually one of the guys that goes back fishing with them, so he might have actually been a fisherman too. Now, he's interesting because remember I was talking about that some of this stuff is spread about, right? That there's different guys who do different things. He is actually the first one to proclaim Jesus to be the Son of God. Right? That's a pretty high honor actually. Right? So in John 1:49 we have him saying, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." And that is very early on. He says that. So Bartholomew really has a really high place in the Gospels in that he is the first one to understand that you are the rightful heir as King of Israel. You are the Son of God.
Wow, that's impressive. Yeah, I think he's just, because he heard Jesus said, "I saw you under the tree."
Right.
And Jesus was impressed. He said, just by that, in other words, he was quick to see.
Right, yeah. So the point being is that sometimes we want to elevate 1 or 2 of these guys over the rest of them, but really the leadership among these guys and the spiritual intuition among these guys is really spread out among these guys. And that's where we talk about that you never pick this one guy and he's the one guy that knows everything. Right? That everybody's got a part to play in this. So then we go on to Matthew. We talked about Matthew the other week, and he's a tax collector, and he's most likely the same as the tax collector that's named Levi. And the reason being that Matthew's a Greek name, Levi's a Jewish name. He was probably going by Matthew because he had adopted his Greek name because he was working for the Romans, right? So now, let me ask you this. We already talked about that 4 of these guys were professional fishermen. How do you think they felt about the tax collector?
They probably didn't like him too much.
Right. So one of the things we need to see here is that Jesus didn't pull from just one side of the fence. Jesus had enough, again, he's Jesus, but we need to follow Jesus and realize that there's probably some people on the other side of the fence from us who have presented with the right argument of what it means to follow Jesus as his disciple. They're as willing to follow Jesus as his disciple as the people that are on the same side. There's going to be people on the same side of the fence of us who aren't going to be willing to follow Jesus as disciple.
Don't exclude a certain crowd of people just for what they do for a living.
Right, or for the political beliefs or something. It may just simply be that they've never really been presented with what it really means to be a disciple of Jesus. And if presented to them correctly, they'll be like, you know what? Yeah, I'm all on board with that. Can you imagine how uncomfortable it was sometimes when they first called Matthew and they're looking at this guy? And because think about it, they're sitting there thinking how much of their money that they worked hard to make, this guy had taken from.
Well, he had extorted too from what he implied.
Right.
He'll restore fourfold. In other words,
right.
They knew it was a
right. Yeah. So they knew he was crooked before he got saved. Can you imagine these business guys? Okay. So the point being, can you see how following Jesus as his disciple breaks down a lot of barriers, and there's got to be a lot of forgiveness, and there's got to be a lot of coming together and growing together in spiritual maturity.
And transformation, otherwise they wouldn't buy it.
Right. All right, so we also have Thomas, and it's interesting, Thomas is probably not his given name, because Thomas means the twin, and in John you have him called Thomas, who is called Didymus. Thomas was, and this is also shows the bilingual part. Thomas was, I think Thomas was the Greek part for twin, the Hebrew for twin. Didymus was the Greek for the twin. So he was called the twin. That was his name, twin. You said twin in one language, the twin in another language. Is what his name was.
What was his twin brother?
See, now that brings up a point. Where was his twin brother at? Again, so you see, you start digging into each of these guys. So here you have like these 5 friends. They're all following Jesus, but then you have this guy who has a twin brother, and if his twin brother's alive, he's not following Jesus.
He was the doubter anyhow, so maybe there was a weakness of faith
Right.
in the family.
Right. So you see, there's all kinds of things you can get out of their names and out of who they are. And like we were talking about, these are regular Joes in regular jobs with regular families who have regular issues like the rest of us. In other words, what are you saying?
It's just funny, 2,000 years later, we still say doubting Thomas.
Right, yeah, that's what he's known for, unfortunately, yeah. But he did. All right, now one good thing about him, so he gets a bad name for being the doubting Thomas, right? He gets a bad name, but one of the things is, it's fairly certain, you can't 100% prove this accurate, but there's no conflicting testimony. A lot of times there's conflicting testimony about how these disciples died, where they died at, and where all they went. There's not a lot of conflicting testimony about Thomas. It's basically considered pretty accurate that he was the first missionary to India.
Amen. Wow.
And that he was martyred in India. It's talking about how quickly the gospel spread. Within his lifetime, he was in India, and it actually didn't take long for it to get from India into China. Right? And so that's an important thing to know about. So we kind of give him a hard time for being doubting Thomas. Then we got to realize this guy went to a completely foreign land with a completely foreign religion, right? And he's over there witnessing, and he ultimately dies for it in India.
And Jesus uses the doubt incident to teach him and to transform him, because he responds by saying, "My Lord and my God."
Right.
You talk about early worship. He was one of the first early worshipers.
Right. He's one of the first guys to point to the deity of Christ. Yep. All right, so now we have another James, and James, again, a fairly common name, James the son of Alphaeus. Again, this is not James the brother of John or James the brother of Jesus. So remember, there's 3 Jameses, so don't get confused, right? All right, now, one thing we hit here is that because he's called the son of Alphaeus, Levi was called the son of Alphaeus. So there's the possibility that they're brothers, but it's kind of doubtful because it never even lists them beside each other or anything. It never really gives us any indication that they're brothers. Could be, could not be, right? But it's just interesting, right? That or there's two guys out there named Alphaeus, with both of them have sons who become disciples of Jesus. It's possible. Now, here's probably my favorite guy, and this kind of guy I wanted to get to today. It's called Simon, who was called the Zealot. Okay, now one of the things we talk about, remember, like I said, there's common words that get turned into titles, like apostle, then there's just regular, the word use of apostle, which meant to be a messenger, and like deacon, deacon was just the word for a servant, and then you had the title deacon. Well, same thing with zealot. So a zealot meant somebody who was just zealous for something, and usually zealous for a religious or political idea. That was a zealot. But beginning in about 6 AD, which is around the time that Jesus was born, there actually became a group of people who were led by a guy named, his name is Judas, and some people looked at him as actually a possible Messiah. He led a group of people who were called zealots, who were military zealots, right? They were looking to militarily overthrow the Roman government. So these would be your extreme right-wing guys who not only own an AR-15, but fully expect to have to use the AR-15 to overthrow the government one day. Are looking forward to using the AR-15 to overthrow the government one day. Not knocking on owning an AR-15, I'm just talking about the guy who's sitting around waiting for the day that he gets to use the AR-15 to overthrow the government. That's these guys. Right? They're just trying to figure out how they can overcome the Romans. How they can get a battle plan up just right, where against insurmountable odds, they can defeat the Romans.
That Roman Empire.
Right? Now, here's a good thing. Here's the thing. Their intentions are good. Okay? We're talking about this on Memorial Day, and this guy kind of brings some stuff to us on Memorial Day. His intentions were to preserve the nation of Israel and the law of God and the worship of the God of Israel. That's his intentions. Right? That's his intentions. And he's willing to die for them. Right? But they're misplaced. Right? Because he doesn't know the future. Like Jesus does. So, and here's where I want to tie this. Here's where I want to tie this into being a disciple of Jesus, because I'll show you this. I was in the military. It is a good thing to preserve the freedom we have in America. It is worth dying for. But here's why. Not just preserving freedom for freedom's sake. The reason the freedom that we have is worth preserving is because it gives us freedom to make disciples of Jesus. Unimpeded. That's why our freedom is valuable. Freedom in and of itself is not valuable. As disciples of Jesus, we understand, and you go back, and really if you look at why we have freedom in America, a lot of it goes back to a guy named Roger Williams, who was originally an Anglican pastor, then became a separatist, and actually planted the First Baptist Church in Rhode Island. He believed for the church to be what it had to be, you had to have religious freedom, which means you had to allow some of the nutballs to be nutballs so that you could have normal church. You had to let the crazy people be crazy and have crazy church, because anytime you put limitations and rules and regulations on churches, you would stifle the church from being the true church. So he made the argument, because he really didn't like Quakers. He really didn't like Quakers at all. He hated their theology. Right? He debated Quakers openly in the public forum, and he believed they had every right to be a Quaker.
Good for him.
Right? He argued with them, believed they had every right to be a Quaker. Okay, so my point being is he recognized that we needed freedom for the church to be, and that's the same thing in America. We have freedom for the church to be what the church is supposed to be. It's worth preserving for that reason. But what we have to be careful about, is getting into the idea where we believe that America, it should be preserved simply because it's America. Or freedom should be preserved simply because it's freedom.
Right.
Because our first job is not to preserve America. Our first job is not to preserve freedom. Our first job is to make disciples of Jesus. And the freedom we enjoy is simply the best environment in which to do that in. Right? Okay, because think about Simon here. Think about Simon the Zealot. Before he switched from being a zealot and being a disciple of this guy who was the leader of the zealots to becoming a disciple of Jesus, his purpose was to preserve Israel and the freedom to worship their God in Israel, right? But what he didn't realize was that was going to go away. Jesus realized that. So what he had to get to the point of was where he understood that his first job was to be a disciple of Jesus and to make disciples of Jesus because Israel was doomed. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Israel was doomed, and it's interesting. You know who really brought upon themselves the doom of Israel? The Zealots.
Rome had it as a...
Yeah, they started a revolution. They finally started a revolution. It brought down... Now, here's the thing. They actually started the revolution for a good reason. The Emperor of Rome was talking about setting up a statue of Zeus in the temple. Right? So they start a revolution. And what happens? It brings down upon them the full wrath of Rome. Rome wipes them out, crucifies most of them, overthrows Jerusalem, and says, you ain't gonna have a temple, you ain't gonna have to put our statue in the temple, we'll just take your temple completely down apart. And you don't have a temple anymore. Kicks all the Jews out of Jerusalem, turns it into a Roman town. Right? The point being is that while his intentions were correct, to preserve Israel, to preserve the ability to worship the God of Israel, Jesus knew that it wasn't going to happen, right? And ultimately, Simon had to make a decision about where his priorities lay. Because here's the thing. He was trying to preserve Israel. He's trying to preserve the worship of the God of Israel. Who did he have standing right in front of him? You see what I mean? And he had to realize that. He had to realize that. Now again, I do believe that America is the freedom the freedom we enjoy in America is worth preserving and it's worth fighting for. But what we have to be careful of is getting to the point where we're simply preserving and fighting for the freedom in and of itself, not for being a disciple of Jesus who makes a disciple of Jesus. Because I want to make this point, because I've made this point before, and I want to make this point again. The church lost its way when it came to discipleship, right? I mean, we're obvious, and we got where we're at. And because of that, this is where we wound up at. This is where we wound up at. This is our plan for preserving religious freedom in America. We're going to try to convince a bunch of unbelievers, false believers, and immature believers to vote for a bunch of false believers, unbelievers, and immature believers who espouse Christian morals and ethics, but half the time don't live for them. That's been our plan for protecting religious freedom in America. Now, I do realize that at this moment, that's the only plan we have. Okay? I'm not telling you don't go vote and don't try to get people in office who are going to preserve the religious freedom in America. I'm not arguing against going and voting because right now, that's the only plan we have. But my point being is that maybe we should work on a better plan.
Transformational discipleship.
Right? And I ain't the other person who ever said this. I was reading a book the other guy, and the guy said the same thing. We really need to be working on making mature disciples of Jesus who become community leaders, who become business leaders, we can vote into offices. You see what I'm saying? Because again, here's my point. Our main goal is to make disciples of Jesus who make disciples of Jesus. It just so happens that that's actually the best way to preserve religious freedom in America. Does that make sense?
A lot of sense.
Because Here's where we messed up. We've been trying to preserve religious freedom in America without making disciples of Jesus. And it's got us to this point where we're trying to convince people who are at best immature believers to at best vote for other immature believers and expect them to preserve religious freedom. We just need a better plan. Again, that's the only plan we have right now, and we got to vote for who we got to vote for to try to preserve religious freedom. But let's work on a better plan.
Amen.
Right? Because here's the other side of that. I hope not. But what if America is just as doomed as Israel is? You see what I mean? What if, we go out and we work hard to make disciples of Jesus, and we make disciples of Jesus, but it's just in the plan of God that it's doomed? I don't know that, but let's just say it is. If we put all our time, effort, and energy into trying to preserve America and religious freedom in America without having put time into making disciples of Jesus, then we wasted our time. But if we put our time, effort, and energy into making disciples of Jesus, it just so may happen that they may preserve religious freedom in America too.
Amen.
You see what I'm saying? And a point of this, a guy I want to point to is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you don't know about him, it's a guy who really kind of brought up in the early 20th century that we had lost discipleship. And the reason he realized that was he was living in Nazi Germany. He had saw what had happened to the churches in Germany, the Christian churches in Germany, how they had fallen away from truly being Christian at all. And because they had fallen away from being Christian at all, Nazism was allowed to take over Germany. He believed that the Christian character of Germany was worth dying for because he was actually out of the country. He was actually living in New York. And he could have sat out the war and waited till the war was over and then went back to Germany to try to rebuild the church. But he said no, because he loved Germany too much. He went back to Germany knowing that it put his life in danger to try to preserve the Christ, so he could work in Germany during World War II to try to preserve the Christian nature and character of Germany and reestablish the Christian character of Germany, right? He believed in it that much, but here's the thing. He died doing so. And he probably would have still done it even if he died doing it, but he didn't even get to preserve the Christian nature of Germany. They got rid of the Nazis, but Germany is not a Christian nation. You see what I'm saying? But did Dietrich Bonhoeffer fail? No, he did not fail. He did not fail because his first priority, even though he loved Germany and he believed that the Christian nature and character of the nation of Germany was worth fighting for to the point that he was willing to die for it, and he did die for it, he still made his first priority making disciples of Jesus, and we now remember him as one of the greatest leaders in the 20th century in making disciples of Jesus because he made that his priority. And here's the thing. If Germany was going to retain its Christian nature, that's the only way it was going to do it anyway. And probably the Christian nature that is retained in Germany has a lot to do with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the men he led, it's still not, you still wouldn't consider it a Christian nation, but any Christian influence that exists in it, a lot of it goes back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So even though he didn't get to preserve everything he wanted to preserve, does that make sense?
Oh, yes.
And I'm not saying that I hope America goes that way. I'm not saying I hope America's doomed like Israel. I'm not saying I hope America goes the way of Germany. My point being is I want to point those two examples of these two men who loved their country, who wanted the best for their country, who were willing to die for their country, but they had to understand that their first priority was being and making disciples of Jesus, and that the best hope for their country was to be and make disciples of Jesus first.
Right.
Does that make sense?
His influence went way beyond Germany.
It went way
still
beyond
does.
Germany. Yeah, it's actually probably has more influence in America than it does in Germany.
Wow. And the cost of discipleship he emphasizes.
Yes, and that it did cost him something, and it was going to cost something. Now, see, because and this is kind of my point. Why did we fall into this trap of trying to preserve religious liberty without being and making disciples of Jesus?
People didn't know.
They didn't know, and also it didn't cost anything.
Oh, yeah.
Now, ultimately, it did cost something because we're in the mess we're in now.
Yeah.
But up front, did it cost much? No, it didn't cost much.
Yeah.
Because being and making disciples of Jesus is costly.
Yeah. It's divisive.
Right. It's costly. It's harder. It takes more determination. It takes more commitment than being a cultural Christian and just trying to maintain Christian culture in your nation. Right? So again, I go back to, I believe that the freedom we enjoy in America is something that is worth fighting for, and men have died for. But I think we need to be careful about trying to preserve that just for its sake. We need to remember what has made America great was the fact that you had these guys who had all read Roger Williams establish America on that principle of freedom of religion so that the true church could flourish and be what it was meant to be. I mean, that was the idea Roger Williams put out. He said you have to have religious freedom, even though you're going to let false churches, these crazy false churches, thrive too. You've got to have freedom of religion so that the true church can thrive and be what it's supposed to be as well. So basically, I can stand up here and say, we've done a terrible job as church making disciples of Jesus. We need to go back and fix that. And people don't come in and arrest me for doing that. Right? That's why it's important to be able to do it. All right, so I really wanted to kind of point to that guy because he's kind of my favorite guy because he reminds me of myself somewhat. Right? He's a guy who had all his passion in this one spot, and his passion was correct, except for the fact that Jesus came along. Does that make sense? If Jesus hadn't came along when he came along, he was right. But the fact that Jesus came along, he had to readjust his priorities and say, yeah, this is important, and yeah, this may even be right, but what Jesus is asking me to do is more important.
Right. Following Jesus trumps
right, and
being a zealot.
Right, and it changes my priorities. So let's go on. The next guy is a guy named Jude of James, and so sometimes that's translated, generally it's translated Jude, the son of James. Sometimes it is in there as Jude, the brother of James. But it's probably Jude, the son of James. And again, so in other words, he's in other Gospels, he's called Thaddeus. And he's most likely, again, these are guys who had multiple names and went by multiple names. And he's most likely called Thaddeus to be confused, to stop from being confused with the other Judas. Because Jude was really said Judas, and so he had the same name as Judas Iscariot, the traitor, and to stop from being confused with him, a lot of times he's referred to as probably as Thaddeus. Okay, so just to try to clear up, you see some of these names sometimes, and they get confusing. And it's also not to be confused with Jude, the brother of Jesus, who wrote the book of Jude. So you have really three Judases / Jude. You have Judas Iscariot, Judas the Apostle, and Jude, the brother of Jesus, who wrote the book of Jude. Okay, so I just want you to know that sometimes these names, there are multiple people with the same name, and then there's sometimes one guy with three names. Right? Okay, now we got to get to the other guy we're going to spend a little time looking at. Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Okay, remember what I said about apostle a while ago? What was an apostle with a big A?
Office.
It was the highest office that has ever existed in the church. And an unbeliever held it. Okay? Let that sink in. Okay? An unbeliever held that office. Right? This is a guy who was face to face with Jesus on a daily basis, who saw Jesus work miracles, who may have even worked miracles himself. And he was an unbeliever.
But it looked good because the other apostles didn't know who it was when Jesus said one would betray.
Right.
They didn't say, oh, Judas, of course.
Yeah, and it wasn't until after the fact that he knew how dirty he really was.
And they trusted him with the money bag.
Right.
Which,
So he came across as trustworthy.
wow.
Okay. What do we take away from this? What do we learn from this? Be very careful about people. be very discerning about religious leaders.
Amen.
Right? Put them through the ringer and see what comes out. Does that make sense? There's a lot of guys who look really good. Right? There's a lot. And you say, well, he's a pastor. He's got this degree. He's got that degree. He graduated from this school. He's part of this denomination. He's at this church. And
it's a big church.
Judas held the highest office that has ever existed in the church, met with Jesus on a daily basis, saw Jesus' miracles, made and performed miracles himself, and was an unbeliever.
Was the treasurer.
Yeah, held the money back, was the treasurer of the group, and was an unbeliever. Put religious leaders, don't be very, very mindful, very, very careful about religious leaders. Put them through the ringer, put what they say through the ringer, right? The Bible tells us to do that. Just because they hold an office, just because they hold a degree, just because they, or whatever, test them, see what's really there. Now here's one thing that we get, this is from the book of Ephesians. So Christ himself gave as gifts to the church the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers to equip his people for works of service. Okay. We talked about with James, primarily it was to mature them into the image of God they originally created to be, but also he pulled these guys out and he gifted them and he taught them to be leaders in the church. Right? And now notice that there's different kinds of leaders. There's separate levels of leaders. Not everybody who's made to be a leader is made to be a senior pastor. I've seen people who were probably be great associates pastors wind up as senior pastors, and it's a train wreck. Right? And then there's guys who should leave their church and go be a senior pastor somewhere who are hanging around as an associate pastor. You see what I mean? So there's people. So in other words, there's different levels of leadership. Now only this, can we have the majority of people be leaders?
No.
No. Just like he only picked 12 to be apostles, only a minority of people are actually gifted with the ability to hold the highest offices. Not everybody's gifted to be a pastor. Not everybody's gifted to be a missionary. Not everybody's gifted to be a teacher. Not everybody is, right? Everybody's gifted to be what, though?
Oh,
A disciple of Jesus. Everybody's gifted to be that, right? You may not be called to lead your business, right? You may be called to stay and run your business and use your business to make disciples of Jesus. You may not own a business. You may simply be an employee, and you're not called to leave your job. You're called to stay in your job and make disciples of Jesus, right? Everybody's called to be a disciple who makes disciples of Jesus, but there's certain men that God has gifted, and there's women because they can fall into some of these, like the teachers, who are being gifted with the ability to lead other people. Now, why are they leading other people? Just for the sake of leading other people? No, here's what he says, to equip his people for works of service. And just so they can go do works of service? No. So that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity. Is it just so we can reach unity?
No.
No. In the faith and in the knowledge of the Son. Just so we can have knowledge?
No.
No. Knowledge of the Son and become mature.
Mature to the point of the
Right.
fullness.
Attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Now what would that mean? That means we act like Jesus.
Yeah. Christ
Right.
like
God, Jesus picked these guys out as leaders, gave them the job as leaders for the purpose of helping people to become the image of God they were originally created to be by being conformed to the image of Jesus. And here's the last thing we're going to close on, 2 Timothy. This is what Paul writes. He says, what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So we are to be on the lookout for faithful men who will be willing to teach others also. Right?
Amen.
Right. So you understand this idea of leadership, and you understand this idea of that we need to be careful who we looking at as leaders. But at the same time, we need to be finding people who have leadership qualities and developing them into be leaders, but not just for the sake of being leaders. So one, so that they're matured into the image of Christ, but then two, so that they can lead other people to be matured to the image of Christ. So we've always got to keep what the end game is in sight. Going back, just like we were talking about when it comes to our country and being devoted to our country and trying to preserve the Christian nature of our country, yes, we should do that. But not simply for the fact of preserving the Christian nature of our country. It's because the Christian nature of our country allows us to make disciples of Jesus who are matured into His image. Does that make sense? Again, always keep that end goal in mind in everything we do.
Amen.
Let's close in prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank You for these examples that You give us in Scripture, that You lay out these details that sometimes we just skim over. When we look really deep into it, we can pull some things out about these guys. We can understand some things about these guys. We can understand that they're not that different from us, and that all of us can be called to be disciples of Jesus who make disciples of Jesus. We ask that in His name. Amen. So we're not really singing, guys. We'll close out the song. In case we got the COVID-19.